Hello, everyone. My name is John Dryden. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies here at Elizabethtown Community and Technical College, and I am very happy to be a part of this Decolonizing the Curriculum project. I'd like to begin just by thanking the Arts and Humanities Division as well as the ECTC Office of Cultural Diversity for helping to put this on. Now, I've entitled this presentation, Returning to the Cave, What It Might Mean to Decolonize the Philosophy Curriculum, for reasons that I hope will become apparent as we go along. But I'd like to begin just by noting that philosophy is in many ways a rather odd academic discipline. Unlike, for example, history or biology or English, usually students have little to no prior exposure to philosophy before coming to college. So for one reason or another, philosophy is rarely taught in high school. And so when students enroll in my introduction to philosophy class, for example, it's usually the first philosophy class and first exposure to academic philosophy that they have ever had. So I can't assume that this general audience here has an understanding of what the philosophy curriculum actually is, much less what it would take to decolonize it. So I just kind of want to give a broad overview on my thoughts on this subject, and I want to do so with the help of Charles Mills, who is a philosopher that you can see pictured at the lower left-hand side of your screen. Charles Mills is a Jamaican-born philosopher who has spent most of his professional career in the United States, and I think that with the help of his philosophical ideas, we can come to both an understanding of what it might mean to decolonize the philosophy curriculum, as well as why that might be a project that's actually worth doing. In his introductory video, Dr. Stearns mentioned that decolonizing the curriculum is not about eliminating white men from the curriculum. And I think he's right about that. But it is worth noting just at the beginning what philosophers you're likely to encounter if you took an Introduction to Philosophy course. Or consider, for example, the ethics course that I teach every semester here at ECTC. From the textbooks that I could choose from, all of them are going to have something to say, if not cover in detail, the thought of the following philosophers depicted here on your screen. So at the top left, we have Socrates. I'm sure you've heard of him before. Then we have Plato and Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Hobbes. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all of these names. There's not going to be a test on this or anything. We have David Hume and Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, John Rawls. And if I asked you one thing that all of these philosophers have in common, I doubt it would take you very long to identify the fact that they are indeed all white men. And unfortunately, this pattern continues on up into the present day. I normally would never compare myself to these great philosophers that are on your screen here, but you can see there is one thing that I have in common with them. And even today, only about 20% of professionally employed academic philosophers are women. That's much lower than other fields within the humanities. And tragically, only about 1% are non-white. Charles Mills, who I mentioned earlier, kind of half jokes about this when he says that when non-white philosophers go to philosophy conferences, they don't take the same plane because if the plane crashed, that would eliminate a very large portion of the non-white philosophers to be represented at that conference. Okay, so you can see here, historically, and even up into the present day, philosophy is a discipline that has been dominated by white males. And it's not just that you're going to encounter a lot of white males. There's also the issue that there's a standard narrative that is told about these figures. For example, Socrates, you might know, was the teacher of Plato, who himself was the teacher of Aristotle, who heavily influenced Thomas Aquinas. And then by the time we get to the Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, they're in many ways reacting against Aristotle. So there's this kind of conversation that's been taking place for 2,500 years. So decolonizing the curriculum isn't about ignoring that conversation. It's not about not listening to what Socrates or Plato had to say. That would be a tragic loss, I think. But it is about critically thinking about that conversation and looking at that conversation through the eyes of the colonized, through the eyes of the subjugated, through the eyes of the oppressed, and thinking a little bit about what role philosophy might have played in that. And so that's what we're going to do here today. So I'd like to begin this critical examination of philosophy itself with a story. And this is probably the most famous story in the history of philosophy. This is known now as Plato's allegory of the cave. It's a story that Plato has his character Socrates tell in his book, The Republic. And in this story, Socrates asks us to imagine prisoners who have been bound in a cave. There's no explanation for how they got into this condition that they are in, but nonetheless, they are here, chained up. You can see them depicted on the left side of your screen, and they're fastened in such a way that the only thing they can do is look at a cave wall and see shadows of objects that are being cast from behind them. And their whole life experiences have been limited to these shadows. And in the story, there's someone who then frees one of these prisoners and turns him around and eventually drags him up outside the cave into the pure sunlight. And for Plato, this is a symbolic story of philosophy itself. The cave represents this physical world, this historical world that we encounter through our senses that we're born into. And philosophy for Plato is about being liberated from this physical world, from this physical condition. And while it's a hard process, walking up this steep hill into the sunlight, into outside the cave, which represents, for Plato, an ideal realm of what he called the forms. These are like abstract, perfect essences, things like beauty itself, or justice itself, or truth, right? These exist beyond this physical world into this realm of the forms. And philosophy is about coming into contact with these eternal realities and leaving behind the physical, historical world. For Charles Mills, this story is the beginning of a very long tendency in philosophy to focus on the ideal, on the abstract, while ignoring the physical, historical realities on the ground. And that continues on up into the 20th century. And so his main target of criticism isn't Plato, but it's a 20th century philosopher by the name of John Rawls. And so we're going to look at what he has to say about John Rawls and why his approach to philosophy might be so problematic. John Rawls is the most influential English-speaking political philosopher of the 20th century. His magnum opus is entitled A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. The basic goal of this work was to try to determine what a perfectly just society would look like. How would a perfectly just society be organized? What basic principles would govern this perfectly just society? In order to answer that question, John Rawls introduces what philosophers call a thought experiment. These are purely hypothetical situations that kind of help us think through things. In this case, help us think about what the basic principles of justice might be. So here's the hypothetical situation. Imagine a group of people around a bargaining table. They're all motivated by self-interest, and they're all trying to come to terms on a contract that will name the basic principles that are going to govern the society that they are about to enter into with one another. But very importantly for Rawls, in order for this to work, in order for this bargaining situation to be fair and just, we need to imagine people doing this in an original position from behind a veil of ignorance. What does he mean by that? Well, he means we'd have to imagine that these people don't know certain facts about themselves. Because if they did know certain facts about themselves, then they would be biased toward their own situation. So to eliminate those biases, we imagine that they are ignorant about many aspects of who they are. So for example, this person in the original position wouldn't know whether or not they are male or female. This person wouldn't know whether they're black or white. This person wouldn't know whether they were born into a rich family or into a poor family. This person wouldn't know whether they had a able body or a disabled body. This person wouldn't know what their own interests are, what religion they might be interested in, or any of those kinds of things. All of that would be something that they would be ignorant of. Then, once we're kind of in this position of neutrality, then we ask, okay, well, what would people in this position, what principles would they agree to? And Rawls thinks that there are pretty clear cases of societies that they would not agree to. So, for example, people in this position wouldn't agree to live in an aristocracy. Why not? Well, I mean, they might be members of the nobility, but they also might be serfs, right? And so they're kind of risk adverse, and so to make sure that they don't end up being a serf, they're not going to agree to the principles of an aristocracy. They also, of course, wouldn't agree to a slave society because, again, they might be a slave, and so to avoid that fate, they would not agree to those principles. They, of course, wouldn't agree to a society where opportunities of employment were only open to men, because, again, they might be women, and so that wouldn't be in their own self-interest. And so what Rawls thinks they ultimately would agree to is basically a kind of liberal democracy where, first of all, there are a fairly extensive set of equal rights. And in addition to that, there's real equality of opportunity, and that there's also a welfare system in place so that any economic inequalities that exist would really work to the advantage of everyone. And so he thinks these are the basic principles that people in this position would agree to, and since they're in this purely neutral position behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, these are the basic principles of justice. Now, none of Rawls's readers would probably disagree that people should have an extensive set of basic rights, or that there should be real equality of opportunity. Charles Mills included. He doesn't disagree with that. His problem, though, is because Rawls has focused on the ideal, right? Think back to Plato's cave. He's outside the cave and this thinking about justice as such. Because he's focused on the ideal, and because racism, for example, wouldn't exist in the ideal society, Rawls ends up writing a 600-page book on justice that actually never mentions any actual racial injustices that occur. Nowhere in the 600-page book, for example, does Rawls mention the transatlantic slave trade. Nowhere does he mention the situation of Native Americans. Nowhere in this book does he mention European colonialism, for example. So these real historical injustices are never addressed in a 600-page book on justice. So, according to Charles Mills, something's gone wrong here. And what's gone wrong is Rawls, as a part of this philosophical tradition that goes all the way back to Plato, is purely focused on the ideal, and that ends up distracting attention away from the actual social injustices that are occurring. Charles Mills's criticism, however, is not simply that philosophy is too one-sided, too focused on the ideal and not wrapped up enough in real-life problems. It is deeper than that. It's that by focusing on the ideal, it allows philosophers to refuse to reckon with philosophy's relationship to what James Baldwin once called the bloody catalog of oppression. The very leisure time that is needed to do philosophy in any meaningful way is built on the back of oppression. We can see this point maybe most clearly by focusing on another philosopher of the canon, namely Aristotle. So again, if you take any introduction to philosophy course or introduction to ethics course, you will no doubt encounter Aristotle. And you will probably learn about his theory of virtues, for example, that virtues like courage and honesty are necessary in order to live a fully flourishing life, and that the role of the state is to allow conditions such that people can develop these virtues, and that virtues are a kind of middle ground between two extremes, right? All of this is kind of uncontroversial stuff. But what you're less likely to hear is the more disturbing aspects of Aristotle's view. So you're less likely to hear, for example, that he thought that women were by nature inferior to men. In fact, he thought that women were just underdeveloped men. You're also less likely to hear that he thought that some people were slaves by their very nature. And if a textbook does mention this, it often sets it aside as kind of being something inessential to Aristotle's philosophy. I actually clearly remember my own introduction to philosophy teacher addressed this issue. And they said that we have to remember that Aristotle was a product of his own time. I guess the idea here is that 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, nobody knew any better. And so we can't blame Aristotle for holding these views that today we would consider to be quite disturbing. The problem with that response, though, is that there were people in Aristotle's day who knew better. Aristotle's own teacher knew better. Plato, for example, argues in the Republic that both men and women should be open to political office. And also that there's nothing in the nature of women that make them inferior to men. Also, Aristotle himself addresses that people hold other views on the issue of whether some people are naturally slaves. This is a quote from Aristotle here on the screen. There are others, however, who regard the rule of slaves by a master as contrary to nature and so has no warrant in justice. This isn't Aristotle's view, but this is the view of others, which he's well aware of. So that leads us to think this isn't just some cultural bias. Maybe this is a view that Aristotle actually came to upon some reflection. And that should get us wondering about whether or not there is something in Aristotle's theory that we should be suspicious about. There is one final criticism given by Charles Mills that I would like to mention here. This is not so much a criticism of philosophy as such, but of the political philosophy of liberalism that goes back to the Enlightenment. Now, one point of clarification I need to make. By liberalism, Mills does not mean what is typically meant by that term in the U.S. context. Okay, he's not referring to liberalism as opposed to conservatism, for example. He's not talking about left-wing liberalism. Rather, he's talking about liberalism in a much broader sense as the ideology of equal rights, of liberty, individualism, the consent of the governed, the basic principles upon which the United States was founded, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those kinds of things. So that whole ideology is what he means by liberalism. This broader sense of liberalism, of the Enlightenment, was against feudalism, for example, and for democracy. And so in this sense, even many conservatives can be liberal in this broader sense of liberalism. Mill's criticism of liberalism in this broad sense is that when you look at the actual history of these ideas, as opposed to just the ideas themselves, we can see a deep inconsistency and hypocrisy in the way that these ideals were applied. And we can see that the very idea of liberty itself being used as a means to justify colonial and racial oppression. And two final examples from the history of philosophy I think can illustrate this criticism. First, let's consider the intellectual giant of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. Kant was not only an Enlightenment thinker, he actually defined the Enlightenment in a famous 1784 essay entitled, "What is Enlightenment?" And like Aristotle, you cannot get out of an introductory ethics class without learning about Immanuel Kant. In this context, no doubt, you will learn about Kant's famous principle of humanity, which serves as his foundational principle for his entire ethical system. And the principle goes like this. You can see it on your screen. So act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Okay, so what is meant by treating humanity as an end? Well, Kant means that you should treat humanity as something that's valuable in its own right. You should treat people with respect and never simply use people or coerce people as a way of getting what you want, merely as a means to your own end. The idea is that you should not use people in a way that they would not consent to, but you should, respect people's freedom, respect people's dignity. And this certainly seems like an enlightened principle that perfectly captures the spirit of liberalism. It would rule out, for example, domineering forms of marriage and slavery and exploitative forms of employment. But once again, Mills directs us to look not just at the ideal principles, but to go back down into the cave, so to speak, to look at the historical situation in which these principles are articulated. Once we do, Mills claims that we will always see in the work of these quote-unquote enlightened thinkers an implicit or explicit distinction between persons who have full moral standing from sub-persons who do not. And in Kant's case, we can see this very clearly. So in an introductory class, you will no doubt learn about this principle of humanity. What you might not learn is what exactly he means by humanity. As it turns out, he doesn't mean Homo sapiens. He means persons who are capable of rational autonomy. That is, persons who are able to make free, rational, moral decisions for themselves. It's those persons whom we should respect. But as it turns out, Kant did not think that women, for example, or non-white Europeans fell into this category. For example, he explicitly denied that women should have the vote on the grounds that they lacked economic self-sufficiency. He didn't even bother to consider why women might lack this economic self-sufficiency. But even more problematic was his views on race. Besides working on philosophy, he also wrote and lectured on anthropology, despite famously never leaving his hometown in northern Germany. And Kant, it becomes clear in these writings, believed in a natural hierarchy of races, with white Europeans at the top and other races ordered below. And he argued that certain natural and inherent characteristics in these various races explain what he saw as a hierarchy of intelligence, talent, capacity for hard work. Thus, by humanity, Kant seems to mean white European men. So what looked like an enlightened principles that could secure basic human rights and liberties, when seen in its historical context, is complicit in colonialism and subjectification. But Kant's views on race, and thus how he would have applied his own principle, is rarely mentioned in introductory textbooks. In addition to Aristotle and Immanuel Kant, there is a third philosopher that almost every introductory course on ethics will cover, and that is the 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill. By the way, not to be confused with Charles Mills, who I've already talked a bit about. John Stuart Mill is probably best known as being the most famous advocate of utilitarianism. This is the ethical theory that very roughly says that the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, based on this principle, Mills advocated for a liberal political ideology in his work on liberty. Additionally, he was a passionate defender of women's equality and emancipation, so he was much more enlightened than the person who wrote What is Enlightenment? However, once again, though, the more troubling aspects of his thought is just ignored often in introductory textbooks. So in On Liberty, Mill argues that the government may not legitimately interfere with your liberty unless it does so to prevent you from harming others. So according to Mill, the government may not intervene based on what are now known as paternalistic grounds. That is, the government can't require you to perform or to refrain from performing certain actions, quote unquote, for your own good. Mill, however, makes two exceptions to that. One is the case of children, which might make sense, but the others is the quote unquote barbarians. And here again we have a quote from Mill on liberty. He says, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. So Mill justifies this exception by saying that until people have reached a certain level of civilization, they are not capable of what he calls quote unquote improvement through freedom of speech and freedom of thought and these kinds of things. At these quote unquote lower levels of civilization, he thought that freedom would lead to chaos and deterioration rather than to improvement. And so Mill was comfortable with his position as a colonial administrator. despite being one of the great champions of freedom and equality. So now, with the help of Charles Mills's criticisms of the Western philosophical tradition, we can see what it might mean to decolonize the philosophy curriculum. It would mean not simply examining abstract ideas and considering arguments for whether or not those ideas are true or false. Instead, it would also involve thinking about the ways in which these ideas have been used in concrete historical circumstances, intentionally or unintentionally, to justify and support various forms of oppression and exploitation. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned Plato's allegory of the cave, where the freed prisoner ascends outside the cave into the sunlight, into the realm of truth, beauty, and goodness. But Plato's story doesn't end there. Plato's story says that the freed man goes back down into the cave in order to help free the other prisoners who are down there. But because his eyes have adjusted to the sunlight, he can no longer see the shadows. He can no longer see what is going on down inside the cave. Charles Mills is also asking us to return back down into the cave, back down into this actual historical world, but precisely so we can see the social injustices that are occurring right before our eyes.